The missile compartment smells like metal and old diesel, and the ghost-sweet tang of hydraulic fluid. It smells like a place made to hold things that crucible a world. Steel ribs, ladder wells, the heavy black boots of the men who sleep in racks directly above the tubes. I stood there for years, on the deck plates where the air pressure in the compartment reads a fraction different than the control room, keeping company with pipes, monitors, and a dozen vertical tubes that point like the teeth of some cold beast toward the sky we will never see. I was the maintenance petty officer for that compartment, the one who walked the tube skirts at 0200, who checked the seals, who logged the temperatures. One tube was always warmer than the others. Say that sentence out loud the way I told it to new guys, and they look where I look, at the temperature column of the watch bill, at the flat green numbers that normally sit like a calm face. The boat's environmental control system is precise. It argues in tenths of a degree inside the missile room because the missiles are whole systems with an built-in intolerance for weirdness. That one tube would sit a degree or two higher than its neighbors, and the data logger would frown in tiny green numerals until someone shifted a damper or flushed an alternate ventilation path. Sometimes it settled back to normal after a half hour of doing nothing, like a patient taking its own medicine. Sometimes it did not. That pattern is what hooked me into the story. The small, persistent misalignment that becomes a fox in the henhouse if you ignore it long enough. Let me explain the space first, because understanding that warm tube means knowing the environment that makes a temperature difference matter. A ballistic missile compartment on a modern nuclear-powered submarine is a long, armored cylinder inside another cylinder. The tubes are vertical. The missiles sit inside ballistic missile tubes, BMTs, that are arranged in 2 rows down the center line. Around them run the access corridors and the systems that keep those missiles from boiling, corroding, or unexpectedly talking to the world. The compartment is a controlled atmosphere. It has dedicated ventilation, filtered, conditioned, and zoned to maintain a steady dew point and to keep contaminants off critical equipment. It has fire suppression systems, pressure seals, and redundant alarms for any change that crosses a design threshold. There are bulkhead penetrations for power and for communications. There are cable trays under ladder rungs. There are bleed lines and desiccant housings and manholes that open only when a dozen hands have signed off. It is built to be boring and dependable, and that's why a deviation registers like a slap. Missile compartments are also, by design, a place of strict separation. Routine maintenance in such a compartment is about choreography and small tolerances, torquing bolts to spec, replacing a gasket with the right durometer, ensuring threads are clean and passivated. The ship's environmental control technicians monitor the intake and exhaust temperatures, the humidity, the pressure gradients between compartments. Missiles are resilient, but their housings and electronics are sensitive. Temperature can do slow damage. Thermal gradients can cause condensate or fatigue. Small heat sources can be the first sign of a failing heater, a leaking instrument, or worse, an electrical short. My first month aboard, an old chief pulled me aside and said simply, "Things get warm before they break." He had the calmness of a man who'd seen pump bearings sing and then fail, and the imperative of experience. He taught me to care about the small things. That warm tube was a small thing, so we took it seriously. The ship's watch bill is a calendar of both people and instruments. Every 4 hours, another petty officer reads the logs, verifies the readings, turns down a fan, or orders a replacement filter. We had digital sensors at 3 positions on the outer hull of each tube and a 4th sensor on the inner flange that measured the air temperature at the lip of the tube opening. The data from all 4 fed into the HVAC module, and it produced an averaged tube temperature number that the engineering officer used on the watch. The
The warmer tube was never a huge delta. This was not a red flashing crisis. But on a sub, the difference between a steady state and a slowly changing steady state is opportunity for mischief. So what made it warmer? The honest, practical answers span several categories, and each one had its own chain of maintenance tasks, investigatory protocols, and risk implications. First, airflow and ventilation. A missile tube is a thermal mass. If the ventilation path that draws conditioned air around it is restricted by a partially clogged filter, a stuck damper, or a kinked flexible duct, the tube's local boundary layer warms. Often the fix is mechanical. Clean the filters, adjust the damper, check for debris in the duct that baffles flow. It's a mundane fix, but it can be easy to miss in a busy schedule. On the boat, we would check the intake screens and the electrically actuated dampers. A 2-degree rise from that source is plausible and not uncommon, especially when the HVAC plant cycles differently in different load scenarios.
Radiant heat from an adjacent system. Ballistic missile compartments are crowded with ancillaries, hydraulics, battery banks for emergency power to certain valves, small generators, oil reservoirs for hydraulic rams, and even occasional test fixtures. One of our tubes sat adjacent to a hydraulic manifold and an oil cooler. If the oil cooler was operating a bit hotter due to a pump slipping or a blocked sea chest, that radiant heat could trickle into the tube skirt. Fix, check the manifold, verify oil temperature and flow rates, and inspect coolers for marine growth if the boat's seawater system is the culprit. On more than one occasion, we replaced a fouled strain on a heat exchanger and watched the tube temperature slide back down like a relieved breath. Third, electrical heating. Many components are quietly electric. Stepper motors for vents, small embedded heaters for electronics racks on missile canisters. Some tactical electronics require temperature control for stability, and the occasional heated conduit to prevent moisture accumulation. An intermittent heater controller or a failed thermistor could allow a small heating element to run long enough to change the measured temperature while not engaging alarms. That scenario is trickier because the heater lives inside an assembly and might not have its own visible LED to tell you it's stuck. In those cases, we had to run electrical checks, take thermography scans, infrared imagers that show hotspots, measure current draws, and follow harnesses to their breakers. Fourth, latent chemical reaction or contamination. Older missiles used propellant systems with benign storability, but if a seal fails or a tiny vapor escapes into the tube's cavity, localized exothermic reactions or corrosion can cause measurable heat. In practice, this is rare. Nuclear-armed ballistic missile systems are subject to intense inspection, and their propellant chemistries are chosen for permanence. Still, contamination from maintenance chemicals, spilled hydraulic fluids, or the slow creep of electrolytic reactions on certain metals can produce heat. That possibility raises alarm differently. Chemical sensors, the smell of solvent, or the presence of oil films on surfaces. We trained to smell, to look for sheen patterns, and to swab suspicious surfaces. Finally, the human factor. A warm tube might be warm because a technician opened a plug, left a powered bench light in a service well, or used a portable heater during maintenance and forgot to remove it. On a long patrol, with fatigue and busyness, human error is perhaps the most predictable cause. My watch team once found a technician's battery-powered work lamp tucked under an access cover, forgotten there for hours. It raised the localized temperature just enough to move the needle. The fix was procedural, not mechanical. Better tool accounting, more disciplined task turnover, and better checklists. Those categories are the non-sensational, mechanical answers. In the real world, they are the reasons that fix 80 to 90% of temperature anomalies. But the story I lived has a different cadence. At first, we assumed a mundane explanation. We cleaned filters, we checked coils, we walked wiring back to the panels. The warm tube's number would dip,
Then a week later, it would return. The recurrence turned curiosity into obsession. So we escalated our diagnostics in a formal way. When a compartment system shows persistent variance, you follow the chain, log the event, notify engineering, place the tube on a watch list, and assign a continuous monitoring team. One petty officer sat at the data console for 24 hours with a laptop, logging minute-by-minute changes, overlaying them with sea state, reactor load, outside temperature profiles, and the heartbeat of other auxiliary systems. We plotted the warm tube's temperature against the boat's course, its battery charge cycles, the runs of the pumps, even the times when the galley used extra power. Patterns started to appear. The warm pulse correlated with two things: long periods of steaming at a certain RPM band and brief post-maneuver transients. In other words, after certain propulsion load changes, the warm tube would creep up. That suggested a coupling between the propulsion plant and the HVAC distribution network, perhaps a shared seawater pump or a shared heat sink. On many submarines, central seawater supply and return lines feed multiple heat exchangers, reactor heat exchangers, HVAC condensers, and hydraulic oil coolers. If a valve modulated in one location in response to a propulsion load change, it could change the flow distribution to an HVAC coil near one tube, passing less chilled seawater to a particular exchanger and letting the air in that zone warm for a period. That is an elegant mechanical explanation that ties the ship's dynamics to local climate change. We traced that possibility. We sat with the engineering officer and the main propulsion tech and created test runs. We throttled the plant to specified RPMs, monitored the seawater loop flows, and sampled temperatures before and after the HVAC coil. The instrument logs corroborated our suspicion. Transient swings in seawater pressure and head pressure could produce a short window where that zone's coil temperature rose and the warm tube followed. The fix became both procedural and mechanical. Adjust the control logic so the coil's bypass valve receives a differential pressure schedule that prevents localized starving during transients, and schedule a filter change to keep that coil cleaner and generate better heat transfer margins. That fix worked for a while, but the warm tube returned, sometimes at different phases in the boat's operation, and sometimes when mechanical engineers swore the control logic was correct. The number refused to be satisfied. That is where things slide from maintenance into the human and the historic.
You need to understand that a submarine is not a static machine. It is a living ecology of protocols and artifacts. Over decades, repairs, upgrades, and tactical mods are layered into the ship. Threaded through that are leftover fittings, spare sections of tubing, and the occasional temporary patch that becomes a permanent hack. Old couplers, rewired harnesses, the history of a previous retrofit. These are relics. A warm tube can become a palimpsest where the recent and the historic mix. In our case, the warm tube's pattern was occasionally coincident with sonar maintenance runs. There is a plausible chain. When the passive sonar suite undergoes calibration runs, the acoustic control unit may use short bursts on dedicated power rails, drawing current in a way that compels associated transformers and step-down circuitry to run hot. Many of these electronics are in instrument racks that route cables near the missile tubes because of space. The heat can leak from conduits to the tubes. We measured and found some correspondences. The warm tube spiked when certain sonar maintenance cycles were scheduled. The immediate fix was to better thermal isolate the cable trays and resequence the maintenance to avoid coincident heating. We did that. For a time, the warm tube slept, and then a third pattern emerged. The warm tube would often sag into higher temperature just before scheduled sea trials with the ballistic missile systems, days before we tested an ejection system or ran a routine check.
That raised a different, more cultural eyebrow. The missile compartment is not just hardware. It's also the theater where launch testing and system checks are rehearsed. Many technicians would come through to do dry runs. On those days, we had extra access time and sometimes had instrumented work lights, portable testers, and more human presence. The warm tube rising before these scheduled activities began to look suspiciously like human operational artifacts. And there was one more layer, historical maintenance records. I spent a week in the archives, turning over the service logs, the longhand memos, the redacted after-action reports from previous patrols. The boat is a machine with a memory. Every significant correction, every small incident is archived. What I found surprised me. The tube that warmed carried the trace of a modification made years earlier by a maintenance crew under time pressure. The mod was recorded by a terse line. Tubes X and Y fitted with bypass return and manifold temp smoothing tie. Temp tie to HVAC manifold installed by prior detachment. See Ref 1996-0731. There was a handwritten addendum. Temporary solution pending part arrival. Temporary solutions are submariners' euphemisms for "we made it work so we could get home." Those small expedients often persist through refits. They are not evil, they are pragmatic, but they are the very definition of an evolving system where thermal and fluid dynamics are no longer as the original engineers intended. So the warm tube had become the long shadow of a temporary bypass. The bypass in the HVAC manifold allowed the flow around a coil to be rebalanced quickly when needed, but it bypassed a pressure sensor that controlled the damper under certain rare conditions. When that sensor was starved and the bypass folded in, the damper schedule would not respond to transient pressure pulses, and the tube zone would experience mild heating, exactly the phenomenon we observed. We fixed the bypass properly. Mechanical technicians reworked the manifold, replaced the temporary couplers with full-spec parts, and installed a redundant sensor and interlock. We documented the repair in triplicate. The warm tube cooled. We thought the case closed. Then an event happened that reminded me that submarines are political places as much as technical ones. A new captain came aboard. That happens. He was the kind of officer who judged a patrol by the breadth of risk he believed he could accept to accomplish a mission objective. He wanted systems available and crew prepared. He also held to a cultural value. Do not let a known issue go unexamined when you can fix it and get on with the patrol. He asked about our warm tube. The engineering staff reported the bypass fix, and he nodded. But 3 weeks later, he asked again, and this time his tone implied he believed something else, that the warm tube might be intentional. Intentional? We were maintained to avoid that thought. But in the climate of nuclear deterrence, where adversaries sometimes use deception or tamper with systems, there is always a non-zero probability that an unexplained anomaly is not purely mechanical. Could a foreign actor have gained access and left a small sensor? Could someone in port have planted a passive listening device that bled subtle heat? Could an adversary be testing whether we'd notice small changes? Those questions open a different operation: security. We pulled out detection tools, non-linear junction detectors that find electronics, radio frequency sweepers that catch unintended emissions, and infrared imagers that reveal hidden heat signatures beyond human sense. The ship's counterintelligence folks, quiet, precise men who wear civilian suits on the deck during port calls, ran background checks and inventory reconciliations. The missile compartment was searched with a fine-tooth comb. Nothing nefarious showed up. No clandestine transmitters, no foreign residues, no tampered strainers. The warm tube's history remained mechanical. But the process of searching did something important. It forced discipline, documentation, and completeness of records that tightened systems. It also taught the crew that even banal anomalies warrant a thought about motives and access control.
There is a final reason the tube could be warmer that ties everything together. Thermodynamics, fatigue, and psychology. Metal expands with heat. Over years, thermal cycles create stress. A small warm band along a tube flange can slowly change the geometry, which over years can change how seals mate. A tiny drift in a flange bulkhead can open a minute path for air to flow differently. The maintenance we do today is the maintenance we will not have patience for tomorrow. Layers of trivial warmings, each fixed in turn, can in aggregate create a permanent difference in behavior. In other words, the tube warmed because the boat had been alive for a long time. Warmth here became a palimpsest of repairs and men. When I tell you the end of the story, it is not a single cinematic reveal. There was no saboteur in the night. There was no miraculous new technology. When the final engineering board convened, they concluded that the warmer tube was the product of three things combined: a legacy bypass that starved an HVAC coil during propulsion transients, a neighbor hydraulic manifold that occasionally gave up heat in certain load regimes, and a human pattern that scheduled maintenance and test activity in ways that slightly increased local thermal load. Each alone might be tolerable. Together, they nudged a thermometer off its center and created a persistent signal. What we learned, and what I include in this account because it matters, is how the Navy responds to the poetic detail of a warm tube. The system response is procedural discipline, better filters, new interlocks, a rework of a pressure sensor, and more careful scheduling of maintenance activity. It also changed people's mental models. Younger sailors who once shrugged at small anomalies were taught to log and to escalate. The chief sat the team down and told the story of a boat that ignored a small bearing sing and lost a pump. He used the warm tube as a teaching tool. Do not let the small slip into a pattern. There is a human epilogue to the story. One of our petty officers, the one who had been on the watch the night I first noticed the warm tube, later left the service. He told me, as we shared coffee on a break, that the tube's small stubbornness changed the way he looked at pencils and planners. He remembered lying on his rack and thinking about how many small things on that boat mattered: a filter, a gasket, the way heat migrates through a bracket. He said it made him patient with details, which in a service where the whole world can depend on a seam is a good trait. At the end of the day, the warm tube story is not a thriller. It is a textbook case in systems thinking. It is about the marriage of mechanical, electrical, and human elements inside a closed environment. It is about the way small deviations become important, not because they are loud, but because the architecture of risk amplifies them. It is about how a life under the water teaches you to love the boring things, because their failure becomes the loudest noise of all. If you want the deep technical footnotes I use to anchor my claims, here is the practical summary for technicians and curious minds. HVAC in enclosed spaces on submarines uses zoned ventilation and relies on seawater-cooled condensers. Transient load shifts and seawater pump head changes can cause coil starvation and localized temperature rise. Redundant temperature sensors with spatial separation reduce false alarms. Spatially averaged sensing is key in large thermal masses. Electrical heaters in instrument racks can produce slow, steady heat. Intermittent thermostat failure can run unnoticed for hours. Infrared thermography is an effective, non-invasive diagnostic tool.
Hydraulic oil coolers and systems adjacent to instrument spaces radiate heat. Fouled seawater exchangers reduce heat rejection and increase compartment temperatures. Human factors, tool accounting, temporary heaters, and scheduling frequently cause repeatable and preventable local thermal anomalies. Clear procedural rules and turnover checklists reduce these most simply and effectively. Legacy modifications and temporary bypasses are common root causes for small, persistent anomalies. Trace log reconciliation and regular refitting to install permanent components are required best practices. Non-linear junction detectors, RF sweeps, and strict access control are part of standard security procedures to rule out clandestine electronics when unexplained thermal anomalies persist. None of these finding routes justify alarm before methodical diagnostics are complete, but they are sensible parts of the investigative toolkit. That micro hook I promised early, the line that should stop you in the first 30 seconds, was this. There is a quiet place on every combat vessel where a steady 2 degrees rise in temperature can become the single thing that brings a boat home or takes it to the shipyard. That single 2 degrees mattered to me. It made me an investigator, a patient man with a clipboard, and someone who believes details keep people safe. If you want this expanded into a formal technical after-action report with schematic diagrams of typical missile compartment HVAC flows, a checklist of step-by-step diagnostics, and annotated spectrograms of the temperature logs we tracked, I'll assemble the appendices and the diagrams for you. For now, this is the story as it lived in the watch bill, a narrative of how small, repeatable anomalies are not only problems to be fixed, but lessons to be taught.